The wind, a merciless blade honed on the vast, unforgiving anvil of the plains, tore at Ilara's thin shawl, seeking the warmth of her skin with an almost personal malice. It whipped strands of her sun-bleached hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink, didn't dare to. Her gaze was fixed, a raw point of focus in the swirling dust and desolation, on the two figures receding into the grey immensity of the late autumn landscape. Jedediah, her late husband Thomas's brother, rode ramrod straight, never once looking back. Beside him, slighter but no less resolute, Martha, her mother-in-law, a woman whose heart seemed to have petrified alongside her grief, was equally unyielding. They were shadows diminishing against a bruised horizon, taking with them the last vestiges of Ilara's fragile security, leaving behind only the echo of their final, chilling pronouncement, "You and the boys get her a burden we can no longer carry. This land, this cabin, it's yours, such as it is. What you make of it is your own concern now." The words, spoken with the flat finality of a nail driven into a coffin lid, still hung in the air, colder than the wind itself. Behind her, huddled in the inadequate shelter of the cabin doorway, 7-year-old Samuel shivered, his small hand clutching the worn fabric of his sister Lily's dress. Lily, barely 5, whimpered softly, her face buried in her brother's side, oblivious to the magnitude of their abandonment but keenly aware of the palpable fear that radiated from her mother like a bitter frost. The cabin, Thomas's dream, now their prison, stood stark and solitary, a flimsy bulwark against the encroaching wilderness. It was a testament to unfinished hopes, its timbers raw, its single window a vacant eye staring out at the endless, indifferent sky. Inside, the meager pile of supplies Jedediah had deigned to leave mocked her, a half sack of flour, a few wizened potatoes, a small barrel of salted pork already showing the first faint bloom of mold. Enough for a week, perhaps 2, if she was mercilessly frugal. And then? The question loomed, vast and terrifying, as empty as the plains that stretched in every direction. Despair, a cold, heavy stone, settled in Ilara's stomach, threatening to drag her down into the dust. But then Samuel sniffled, a small, brave sound that pierced through her numbness. She turned, forcing her frozen limbs to move, her face a mask she hoped conveyed a strength she did not feel. The wind howled, a mournful chorus to their isolation, and the dying light cast long, skeletal shadows that danced like specters. This was it. The precipice. And beneath, only the fall. The last sliver of sun bled from the sky, plunging the world into an inky, frigid darkness. Inside the cabin, Ilara moved with a forced, jerky energy, the earlier paralysis giving way to a frantic need to act. She pushed the rough-hewn table against the ill-fitting door, wedging a split log beneath its handle for added security. The wind found every crack and crevice in the cabin walls, whistling a mournful dirge, making the single tallow candle sputter and dance. Lily, exhausted by fear and cold, had cried herself to sleep on the straw-filled mattress in the corner, curled tight against Samuel, who lay awake, his eyes wide and dark in the flickering light, watching his mother. Ilara avoided his gaze, shame and a fierce, protective love warring within her. How had it come to this? Thomas, her Thomas, strong and kind, struck down by a fever that had swept through the small settlement months ago, leaving her a widow in a land that had little mercy for unsupported women. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, in the bonds of family, in the shared grief that should have united them. Instead, Martha's sorrow had curdled into resentment, Jedediah's pragmatism into a cruel efficiency. She was an extra mouth, her children liabilities. The memory of their departure, the finality of their turned backs, was a fresh wound. She ran a trembling hand over the rough surface of the flour sack. So little. The vastness of the plains pressed in, a tangible weight of isolation. Every creak of the cabin walls, every howl of the wind, every rustle in the dry grass outside sounded like a threat. Wolves, she knew, roamed these lands. And other dangers, too, desperate men, perhaps, made lawless by hardship. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She stoked the small fire in the hearth, the meager flames a fragile beacon against the oppressive dark. The children needed warmth, needed food, needed to believe she could keep them safe. She portioned out a sliver of salted pork and 2 small potatoes, boiling them with a pinch of precious salt. The smell, though meager, filled the small space, a fleeting comfort. As the children ate, their hunger momentarily eclipsing their fear, Elara felt a flicker of something other than terror. A grim resolve. They would not starve. Not while she drew breath. She would not let Martha and Jedediah have the satisfaction of her demise. She would fight. For Samuel. For Lily. For the memory of Thomas, who had loved this harsh land and believed in its promise. Tonight, the fear was a living thing, coiling in her belly. But tomorrow, she would face the dawn, and she would find a way. She had to. The alternative was unthinkable, a darkness deeper even than the prairie night. Days bled into one another, each a desperate struggle against hunger, cold, and a gnawing loneliness that settled deep in Elara's bones. The small store of food diminished with alarming speed, each carefully measured portion a reminder of their precarious existence. She ventured out daily, a heavy axe clutched in her raw hands, to scavenge for firewood, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her ears straining for any unfamiliar sound. The silence of the plains was a deceptive beast, it could be broken in an instant. Samuel, bless his resilient heart, tried to help, his small hands gathering twigs, his face set in a serious imitation of his father's solemnity. Lily, more fragile, clung to Elara's skirts, her large eyes reflecting the fear that her mother fought so hard to conceal. One morning, not far from the creek where she fetched their water, Elara found them, large, distinct prints in the damp earth. Wolf tracks. Her blood ran cold. They were close, too close. That night, the fire burned brighter, the door was barricaded with an extra log, and sleep was a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the distant, chilling howls that seemed to circle their tiny refuge. The children huddled closer, and Elara lay awake, the axe beside her, her senses preternaturally sharp. The terror was a constant companion now, but with it grew a grim determination. She learned to read the subtle signs of the land, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the few birds, the rustle in the tall grass that might mean a rabbit, or something far more dangerous. Then, one afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows, he appeared. One moment, the landscape was empty, save for the swaying grass, the next, he was there, standing at the edge of the small clearing around the cabin, as silent and sudden as a hawk alighting on a branch. He was tall, lean, clad in buckskin, his dark hair long and unbound save for a single feather. His face, copper-skinned and sharp-featured, was unreadable, his eyes dark and penetrating as they surveyed the cabin, then Elara, who froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A Cheyenne. The stories she had heard, whispered in hushed tones back in the settlement, flooded her mind, tales of savagery, of raids, of unyielding hostility. Samuel, who had been attempting to whittle a stick with a dull knife, scrambled back towards the cabin, pulling a terrified Lily with him. Elara stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide. But where? There was nowhere to go. Her hand instinctively went to the axe, still leaning against the cabin wall where she'd left it after chopping kindling. His gaze flickered to the movement, then back to her face. He said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the incessant sigh of the wind and Lily's stifled sobs from within the cabin. He was an unknown, a terrifying embodiment of the wildness she was so desperately fighting to keep at bay. Her fear was a cold, sharp point, yet beneath it, a strange, fatalistic calm began to settle. Whatever was to happen, would happen. The warrior remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes missing nothing, the decaying state of the cabin, the threadbare clothes Elara wore, the haunted look in her eyes. Elara, in turn, studied him, her initial terror slowly giving way to a desperate, wary curiosity. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows, a knife sheathed at his hip. He was armed, capable, yet he made no threatening move. His stillness was more unnerving than outright aggression would have been. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to make no sound at all, he turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the linter where her pitifully small woodpile lay, then towards the creek. He looked back at her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something in his eyes, not pity, but perhaps a kind of acknowledgement of their desperate state. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone, melting back into the tall grass as if he were a part of the landscape itself. Ilara's breath escaped her in a ragged gasp. She leaned against the cabin wall, her legs trembling. Had she imagined him? Samuel crept out, his face pale. Mama? Was that you an Indian? Ilara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She pulled her children inside, her mind racing. Why had he come? Why had he left without a word, without an action? The encounter left her more unsettled than before. The known threat of starvation and cold was somehow less terrifying than this unknown human element. The following morning, Ilara approached the woodpile with trepidation. Lying on top of the stacked logs was a freshly killed rabbit, its neck cleanly broken. Her heart lurched. She looked around wildly, but the plains were empty, indifferent. He had returned, unseen, and left this offering. A gift? A warning? Her mind struggled to comprehend it. Hunger warred with suspicion. The children hadn't eaten meat in days. She carefully picked up the rabbit, its body still faintly warm. That evening, as the scent of roasting meat filled the small cabin, a richer, more substantial aroma than they had known for weeks, Ilara found herself looking towards the door, towards the empty plains, with a new and complex emotion. Fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a reluctant gratitude and a profound uncertainty. Later, as she banked the fire for the night, she noticed something else. A section of the cabin wall, where the chinking had crumbled away leaving a sizable gap, had been crudely but effectively patched with mud and grass. It was not her work. He was watching them. Helping them. But why? The question echoed in the silence, unanswered. His visits, if they could be called that, became an unspoken routine. Cale, for she had heard Samuel whisper the name, perhaps gleaned from some half-forgotten tale, and it seemed to fit the silent warrior, would appear at a distance, sometimes just a fleeting figure on the horizon, sometimes closer, a still sentinel observing their small domain. He never approached the cabin directly when she was outside, never spoke. But his presence was a constant, a silent counterpoint to their isolation. After one particularly vicious night of wind and freezing rain that had threatened to tear the flimsy roof from the cabin, Ilara awoke to find a small pile of dry, seasoned firewood stacked neatly by the door, far superior to the damp, green wood she had been struggling to burn. Another time, after she had spent a frustrating morning trying to mend a hole in Samuel's worn-out boot with inadequate tools, she found a sharp awl and a length of sturdy sinew lying on the rough-hewn bench outside. Small offerings, practical solutions to their most pressing needs, left without ceremony, without expectation of thanks. Ilara, in turn, began to leave her own silent offerings. A portion of their meager stew, left on a flat stone near the edge of the clearing. A piece of bannock, when she had flour enough to spare. Sometimes the offering would be gone by morning, other times it remained untouched, a silent refusal or perhaps a sign that he had no need of it. She began to study him from afar, noting his efficient movements, his deep connection to the land. He moved like a shadow, his senses acute. She saw him once, tracking something in the distance, his body low to the ground, every line conveying intense focus. He was a part of this wild, untamed world in a way she could never be, yet he was extending a thread of connection, however tenuous, to her and her children. The children, initially terrified, began to watch for him too. Lily, with the innocent fearlessness of the very young, once waved a small, hesitant hand in his direction when he stood silhouetted against the setting sun. Cale did not wave back, but Ilara, watching from the cabin doorway, thought she saw his head incline, a barely perceptible acknowledgement. Samuel, more reserved, would simply stare, his young mind clearly grappling with the image of this man who defied all the frightening stories he had been told. Trust was a slow, fragile seed, planted in the barren soil of desperation and watered by these small, unspoken kindnesses. It was a trust born not of words, but of shared space, of observed actions, of a mutual recognition of the harsh realities of their existence on this unforgiving frontier. Ilara still clutched the axe a little tighter when she saw him, the ingrained fear of the unknown dying hard. But now, there was something else too, a hesitant reliance, a flicker of something akin to hope. The early snows arrived, not in a gentle dusting, but as a furious blizzard that swept across the plains, transforming the landscape into a monochrome wilderness of white. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the small cabin, and for 3 days, Ilara and the children were trapped inside, the world beyond their door a swirling vortex of snow and ice. Their firewood dwindled at an alarming rate, the cold seeping through the patched walls, chilling them to the bone despite their huddles around the hearth. Lily developed a cough, a dry, rasping sound that tore at Ilara's heart. Fear, sharp and immediate, returned with a vengeance. She had so little to fight this new enemy, no medicines, only weak, herb-infused water that seemed to do nothing. On the second day of the storm, when the wind momentarily abated, Ilara peered through a tiny scratch in the frost-covered window. And there he was. Cale. A dark, solitary figure moving through the driving snow with an almost supernatural ease, his shoulders hunched against the wind, but his progress steady. He carried something. He did not come to the door, but later, when the storm had passed and a fragile sun glinted on the pristine snow, Ilara found a bundle of dried herbs tied with a strip of rawhide on the woodpile, alongside 3 plump grouse. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that the herbs were for Lily's cough. She brewed them as she imagined he would, a strong, bitter tea. Lily drank it, grimacing, but within hours, the harshness of her cough began to ease. The grouse, roasted over the fire, provided a strength they desperately needed. This act, more than any other, began to dismantle the remaining walls of Ilara's suspicion. It was not just about survival anymore, it was about care, a silent, gruff form of protection that extended even to the health of her child. She began to see not just the warrior, the outsider, but the man. A man who understood the land, its dangers, and its remedies. A man who, for reasons she could not fathom, had chosen to help them. One afternoon, a week after the storm, Cale appeared at the edge of the clearing. Samuel, bolder now, was attempting to set a simple snare Ilara had fashioned from a frayed piece of rope, his small face furrowed in concentration. Cale watched him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he walked towards the boy. Ilara's breath caught, but she held her ground. Cale knelt beside Samuel, and with a few deft movements of his powerful hands, adjusted the snare, showing the boy how to position it more effectively, how to read the subtle signs of an animal's passage. He spoke no words, but his actions were clear, instructive. Samuel watched, rapt, his earlier fear forgotten in the presence of such evident skill. Later, Lily, holding a small, smooth stone Cale had seemingly dropped, shyly offered it to him. Cale looked at the stone, then at Lily's hopeful face. He didn't take it, but he touched her small hand very briefly, a fleeting contact, before rising and melting back into the trees. Ilara saw the ghost of a smile on Lily's face, and a profound shift occurred within her. The fear was receding, replaced by a quiet respect and a dawning, unspoken gratitude that warmed her more than any fire. The thaw brought with it a fragile greening of the plains, but also a new unease. Word, carried on the wind by a lone, grizzled trapper passing far to the south of their cabin but whose distant campfire Ilara had nervously watched one night, spoke of increased unrest. Bands of desperate men, made bold by hunger and the lawlessness of the frontier, were said to be roaming, preying on isolated homesteads. The trapper had also mentioned, with a knowing look that made Ilara's blood run cold, that Jedediah and Martha Colson had been making inquiries in the nearest settlement, not about her welfare, but about the legal claim to Thomas's land, meager as it was. The thought of her in-laws returning, not with aid, but with greed in their eyes, filled her with a cold dread. They would not care what became of her or the children, they would only want the land, perhaps believing it held some future value or simply to erase the last remnants of Thomas's independent life. Cale, too, seemed to sense a change in the atmosphere. His appearances became less predictable, his scrutiny of the surrounding landscape more intense. Ilara would see him on the distant ridges, a solitary silhouette against the vast sky, his posture alert, watchful. He began to leave more substantial offerings, not just game, but pieces of cured hide that Ilara, her own skills slowly growing, could fashion into better shoes for the children, or use to patch the ever-present drafts in the cabin. He showed Samuel how to track, not just rabbits, but larger game, and, more importantly, How to recognize the signs of human passage: a broken twig, a disturbed stone, the faint imprint of a boot where only moccasins should tread. Elara, watching these silent lessons, felt her own resilience hardening. She was no longer the terrified, helpless woman her in-laws had abandoned. She had learned to survive, to read the land, to provide for her children in this harsh world. But this new threat, this human menace, was different. It was a danger she could not face alone. The unspoken alliance with Cale shifted. It was no longer just about his knowledge of the wilderness supplementing her deficiencies, it was about his strength, his warrior's instinct, becoming their shield. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Cale appeared closer to the cabin than he ever had before while she was outside. He carried his bow, and his eyes, usually so calm and unreadable, held a new sharpness. He gestured to the north, then made a subtle sign with his hand, 3 fingers, then a motion indicating riders. 3 men. Coming this way. He looked at Elara, a question in his gaze. She understood. He was warning her, preparing her. And in that moment, she knew he would not let them face it alone. Her hand went not to an axe this time, but to the old, heavy rifle Thomas had owned, a relic she had barely known how to load until Cale, in one of his silent tutorials, had shown her its workings, ensuring it was clean and ready. She was afraid, but it was a different fear now, not the paralyzing terror of before, but the fear of a mother protecting her young, a fear that sharpened the senses and fueled a desperate courage. The men arrived 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the vast sky in bloody strokes of crimson and orange. There were 3 of them, as Cale had indicated, rough-looking, their faces hardened by wind and want, their eyes holding a predatory gleam. They rode with a swaggering confidence, their horses worn but serviceable, their guns prominently displayed. Elara had seen their like before, drifters who haunted the fringes of settlements, looking for easy prey. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground in the doorway of the cabin, Samuel and Lily huddled behind her, the heavy rifle clutched tightly in her hands. She had made her preparations, however meager. The door was barred from the inside, save for her own exit. The children knew to stay hidden. The leader, a burly man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, leered at her. "Well now, what have we here?" A little prairie rose all alone. His companions chuckled, their eyes raking over her, then the cabin. "We're just looking for a bit of hospitality," the scarred man continued, his voice falsely jovial. "Maybe some food, a place to rest our heads for the night." Elara's voice, when she finally found it, was steadier than she expected. "There's little enough here for myself and my children. You'll find nothing to spare." "Oh, I think we'll be the judge of that," he said, dismounting, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The other 2 began to fan out, their intentions clear. Just as the scarred man took a step towards her, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the creek bed. Cale. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, his bow already strung, an arrow narked. He didn't shout, didn't posture. His presence alone was a palpable threat, a sudden, unexpected obstacle in their path. The drifters froze. Their bravado faltered in the face of this silent, buckskin-clad warrior who seemed to have materialized from the earth itself. "This is not your concern, Indian," the scarred man snarled, his hand tightening on his pistol. Cale's eyes, dark and flat as river stones, remained fixed on him. He said nothing, but his stance, the tension in his shoulders, spoke volumes. Elara raised the rifle, its barrel unwavering despite the tremor in her arms. "He is with us," she stated, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "Leave now, and there'll be no trouble." For a tense moment, no one moved. The air crackled with unspoken violence. The scarred man weighed his options, his gaze flicking between Cale's deadly readiness and Elara's determined stance. He clearly hadn't anticipated resistance, let alone this kind. His eyes narrowed with anger, but also a flicker of fear. These lonely places bred desperate folk, but also, sometimes, unexpected guardians. Finally, with a curse, he spat on the ground. "This ain't worth it. Let's go." He backed away slowly, his men following suit, their eyes still darting nervously towards Cale. They mounted their horses and rode off, not with the swagger they had arrived with, but with a haste that spoke of their unease. They did not look back. The hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the plains, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with the residue of fear and adrenaline. Ilara's arms ached from the strain of holding the heavy rifle, and she lowered it slowly, her breath shuddering out of her. Samuel and Lily crept from their hiding place, their small faces pale but their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. Cale remained where he was for a long moment, his gaze following the direction the drifters had taken, ensuring they were truly gone. Then, he unstrung his bow, the simple movement releasing some of the tension from the air. He turned, his eyes meeting Ilara's. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet watchfulness. The silence that fell between them was different now, deeper, imbued with the shared experience of danger faced and overcome. It was the silence of comrades, of allies who had stood together against a common threat. He walked towards the cabin, stopping a few feet from her. He looked at the rifle she still held, then at her face, his gaze lingering for a moment. She saw a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes, respect, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement. He had seen her fear, but he had also seen her courage. She, in turn, had witnessed his unwavering strength, his silent promise of protection made real. She finally found her voice, the words rough. "Thank you." It seemed inadequate, a small, flimsy word for the magnitude of what he had done, for the safety he had ensured. Cale merely inclined his head, a gesture that conveyed more than words could. He glanced at the children, who were now staring at him with open admiration. Lily, emboldened, took a tentative step towards him. He did not retreat. The immediate threat had passed, but the encounter had irrevocably changed the landscape of their lives. Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her world had been pared down to its essentials, her children, this small patch of earth, and this man who had become their unlikely guardian. The harshness of the plains remained, the future was still an unknown territory, but she was no longer entirely alone in facing it. Her transformation was palpable, even to herself. The desperate, frightened widow had found a core of steel within her, forged in the fires of abandonment and tempered by the daily struggle for survival. She had learned not only to endure, but to fight. And in Cale, she had found not a savior in the conventional sense, but a partner, a silent sharer of burdens, a kindred spirit who understood the language of resilience. He turned as if to leave, his gaze sweeping the horizon once more. But then he paused, looking back at the small, vulnerable cabin, at the woman and her children. The choice lay before them, unspoken but clear. He could melt back into the wilderness, his duty done. Or he could stay. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft lavender and rose, a stark contrast to the violent reds of the previous evening. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin and its inhabitants. Cale had not left. He had made a small, efficient camp a little distance away, within sight of the cabin but respecting their space, a silent sentinel against the encroaching night. Ilara watched him from the doorway as she prepared their meager evening meal, a stew thickened with the last of their flour, flavored with wild onions Cale had shown her how to find. The aroma, usually a source of anxiety due to dwindling supplies, tonight carried a different scent, the faint, comforting smokiness of Cale's nearby fire, a subtle reminder of his protective presence. Samuel and Lily, their earlier fear replaced by a childish fascination, chattered quietly, their voices softer, less strained than they had been in months. Lily even attempted a small, skipping dance near the hearth, a sight that brought a painful lump to Ilara's throat. It was a lightness she had feared she would never see in them again. Later, as the stars began to prick the darkening canvas of the sky, Ilara did something she would not have dared to do weeks before. She took a small bowl of stew and a piece of freshly baked bannock. She had used a precious handful of flour, a silent offering of gratitude, and walked towards Cale's camp. He was sitting by his fire, mending a strap on his quiver, his movements economical and precise. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. She placed the bowl and bread on a flat stone near him. "For you," she said softly. He looked at the food, then at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he reached for the bowl. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact, yet it sent a strange warmth through Elara, a spark of connection that transcended language and custom. He ate in silence, not with the ravenous hunger of a starving man, but with a dignified appreciation. Elara sat a little distance away, watching the flames dance, a comfortable quiet settling between them. The future remained a vast, uncharted territory, fraught with uncertainty. The threat of her in-laws still loomed, a distant shadow. But tonight, under the immense, star-dusted sky, Elara felt a profound shift within her. The crushing weight of solitude had eased. She was no longer just a widow abandoned, but a woman who had found an unexpected strength, an unlikely ally. She thought of the prairie, once a symbol of her desolation, now a testament to her endurance. It was still a harsh land, demanding and unforgiving. But it had also offered an unexpected gift, a connection forged in shared hardship, a partnership built on silent understanding. As she rose to return to the cabin, Cale looked up. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not the stoic warrior, but a flicker of shared humanity, a silent acknowledgement of the path they now walked, if not together, then alongside one another. A fragile hope, resilient as the prairie grass after a storm, began to take root in her heart. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long, long while, Elara felt she was not facing it entirely alone.